Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers, people who turn their passion into a reality, sometimes against great odds. They come from all walks of life: entrepreneurs, authors, musicians, artists, inventors. Today, our guests occupy a very special niche: collectors of lovers' eyes, elaborate pieces of miniature jewelry embedded with the painted eye of a loved one, most commonly someone mourned or a paramour, such as a mistress. David and Nan Skier, whose collection of these lovers' eyes from the Georgian era, the 1700s to the early 1800s, is hailed as among the most extensive of its kind in the world. They join us from their home in Alabama. This podcast is brought to you by A.M. Skier, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Welcome, Nan and David. So nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Our pleasure.
David, you are an ophthalmologist, and it was while you were attending a medical conference in Boston some years ago that you and Nan, already antique aficionados, discovered at an antique show these very interesting miniatures. What literally, I'm going to say it, caught your eye? What did you see exactly?
Well, both of us remember that day very, very well. It was probably in the 1980s, and there was a medical meeting in Boston. And Nan and I went to Boston. And as we've done throughout the world on our travels, we always go to museums to look at art because we collect art from the Ashcan School, which is American art from the 1890s to 1913. And we also then went to an antique fair at the Cyclorama, which is still in Boston, and they still have antique fairs there. And we were looking around, walking around, looking at this and looking at that, like it's something else. And we didn't see anything, but there was a case which was two-sided. There was a man and a woman behind it. And on the bottom shelf in the center was this eye centered on a ring. And I had no idea what it was. And then look at that. Isn't that strange? And the man who was manning the booth and his mother later became very good friends. And he said, "Do you know what that is?" I said, "I have no idea what that is." He said, "That's a lover's eye." He didn't say at the time that his mother had coined the term, but she did. He said, "Well, let me tell you about it." And he told us about it.
Before we talk about it, perhaps I'll show it. I'm wearing the ring today.
Yes, it is. I'm so glad that you're wearing it. Why don't you, for our audio audience as well, why don't you describe what we're looking at? What it's embedded in.
What we're looking at is a beautiful ring. It is oval in shape. It is surrounded by seed pearls on the outside, and then an oval of blue enamel and tiny diamonds embedded in the blue enamel. And in the center of the ring is an image of an eye. And the eye is painted in watercolor on ivory, and it is covered by glass. And when we bought the ring, when we inquired about the ring from the people who were selling it, Barry and Edith Weber, Barry said, the ring comes with a warning and the ring comes with a story. And the warning is, do not wash your hands while you are wearing this ring, because it is watercolor on ivory. And if you wash your hands, even though the watercolor is covered by glass, it can wash away. And it is almost 300 years old. So please be careful. That's the warning. And then David maybe will tell you the story about the background of this ring.
Before you do that, which I think I do want to hear the story, I love the way the ring on your finger, it's kind of vertical. So when you lift your hand, the eye looks back at you. Is that correct?
Yes, if I have it facing in the right direction, I have it facing outward so that you can see it. But if I turn it to myself now, yes, it's correct. It's right side up and it's beautiful. And it does look like it's looking at you.
Now tell us the story behind the ring.
It's complicated, but it started just a time frame. To me is interesting. Lover's eyes were first thought about 1770. That's when George III was King of England. And that's when the United States Revolutionary War was just thought about. And George III was the King of England who put the tax on tea, and in the Boston harbor where they threw the tea into the harbor because they didn't want to pay the tax. Anyway, George III had a disease that ran in the Georgian family at the time called porphyria. Porphyria is a disease where you become mentally incompetent and it is lethal. He had a son whose name was George, and he was going to become George IV, but he was George the Prince Regent. And what a Prince Regent is where the king, he declares himself or is declared incompetent, but he's still alive. And he appoints the next king to be the Prince Regent, which means he rules, but he's not the king yet. And George IV, or then the Prince Regent, he went by the nickname Prinny, had a girlfriend. And we have a very, very good friend who's a archbishop in the Catholic Church, and we were told, and he says it's still true today, that a Catholic cannot ascend the throne in England. He went to his father and said, I have this girlfriend. His father said, well, you know you cannot marry her because of her being Catholic. She had been married twice before, and both husbands had become deceased. But the reason that he was not allowed to marry his love was because of her religion. So it started that George had an eye painted of his, and Maria Fitzherbert had an eye miniature painted of theirs so that they could recognize each other, but no one else could. George the Fourth to be is one we don't have. It's a miniature eye. He wore it on the inside of his coat, on the lapel of his coat on the inside, so he could flip it back and look at her and smile and recognize her, but no one else could tell who it was. And he asked to be buried with it. It's in Windsor Castle in the cemetery where all of the royals go. That was the story that we were told.
In one of the books, of course, about your collection, it does say it all started with a forbidden romance. But they continued to see each other throughout their lives, did they not?
They actually married in secret. Maria Fitzherbert was a devout Catholic, and she did not want to be a mistress, but George persuaded her that they should marry. And so they had what was called, at the time, a morganatic marriage, which was also called in slang a left-handed marriage. And so they married in secret, and Maria Fitzherbert agreed that with this marriage, she would not have any of the rights of the royal family. And if they had any children, those children would not have any of those rights either. And so in Georgian England, even though they married in secret, it was kind of an open secret. And everyone in society knew that they were secretly married. And everyone had heard about the fact that they had exchanged these eye miniatures. And so eye miniatures became all the rage in Georgian England because everyone wanted to emulate the royalty. That's how they had their start, and that's how they became popular in this particular time.
So there's a lot of symbolism there in terms of not being able to recognize the eye. Do you know the sitter behind your ring? Do you know anything about that particular eye?
We do not know anything about this particular eye, and I would say that for 90, perhaps 98% of the eyes that we have in our collection or that we have seen, the sitter is unknown. It was supposed to have been a secret, and unless there is some indication, for example, some engraving on the back of the piece that might give you a clue as to initials or a name or a date of death in the case of a memorial piece, we do not know. There are a few pieces, perhaps a half a dozen in our collection, that we have been able to do the genealogical research on. So we do know whose eye it is, but most of them are a mystery. And that's part of the charm, is that what we know is that someone loved this person enough to have commissioned a miniature of his or her eye and set it into a piece of jewelry.
Is there anything that the jewelry itself tells you? For example, it's made with turquoise or pearls or diamonds. Do the stones tell a story?
Yes, the materials clearly tell a story. For example, the ring that I'm wearing right now has a border of seed pearls. So sometimes seed pearls can be read as a symbol for tears. And so if you see pearls surrounding one of these pieces, it sometimes means that it was a memorial piece and that it was made posthumously in memory of an individual who was loved. Sometimes you will see painted on the piece what look like clouds. And if you see that, sometimes it's a space filler and it's for composition, but sometimes it means that that person has gone to heaven, and that too indicates it's a memorial piece. And in Georgian and Victorian England, there was a language of jewels. And so many of the stones, for example, turquoise, as you mentioned, have meaning. And turquoise at the time was believed to have had properties that could intuit the health of the sitter. And so it was believed that, for example, if a person who was wearing turquoise was ill, that turquoise would become darker in color. And when the person returned to health, the turquoise would retain its original color.
You know, you yourself have described these as pieces of art, precious jewels, and fragments of history. And all of those are definitely rolled into this. What part about those things intrigues you the most? Do you have any favorite stories? I know I did read as much as I could of the two books about your collections. One is called The Look of Love, and the other, of course, is called Lover's Eyes. And the story of Anna Marie Bennett really struck me because it was a story not only of someone who had illicit love, but then they weren't sure about how the admiral's life ended. Do you remember that story? Could you tell that story?
Yes, we determined who this was by some engraving on the back of the piece. And what we discovered, truth is stranger than fiction. The individual who is pictured in the piece, whose eye is pictured in the piece, very much looks like a male eye when you look at it. But we have come to discover that A.M. Bennett was really Anna Maria Bennett. And she has a fascinating story. She was a widow and she was left without funds. So she went to work in a chandler's shop, which was a shop which sold seafaring equipment. One day, as she was working in the shop, a gentleman came in and he was very taken by what he called her kind attention. And she became his housekeeper. However, it is known that she and the seafaring gentleman had 2 children together. And so we know that Anna Maria Bennett lived with this gentleman as his wife. And we also know that her daughter became a very famous actress in England, and that she was the original stage mother who pushed the daughter into this theatrical career. And we also know that she was an author who wrote books of very controversial topics for their day, and they are still in print. However, the romance ended unhappily when a letter, which was intended for another woman, written by the gentleman, wound up in Anna Maria Bennett's hands. And coincidentally, 2 weeks later, her husband passed away. So we don't know what the circumstances were.
So did he paint the eye or have the eye painted for her?
We believe so. We don't know that for sure, but that's what we believe, yes. It's one of the few pieces, and it's pictured in our book, for which we have an actual image of the person's whole face. And we know who she was, and we know what she looked like.
Wow. We don't know what happened to the admiral, but we know what she looked like. Do you have any favorite stories yourselves? You must have uncovered quite a few more.
The stories are endless because of the fascination with the objects. Here's a fabulous eye.
Beautiful. And why don't you describe this? Is that gold?
Yes, the bracelet is gold. There is a small painted eye. It's circular with a gold floral surround. And then the band of the bracelet is created out of woven hair.
Oh, my. Assumed to be the hair of the sitter?
Yes, Nan will tell you, but a lot of our lover's eyes have hair attached to them, and hair lasts forever. These objects are 300 years old, and they look just like hair that you would have on your head today.
Well, the story behind this bracelet is the story of the Prince of Wales, who became George IV of England. And when he was the king, even though he had married Maria Fitzherbert in secret, and that was not a legitimate marriage, he was persuaded to marry his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick, in order to create an heir to the throne and continue with the royal family.
And to pay off debts.
And to pay off many, many debts which he had accumulated over a period of time. And so even though it was an extremely unhappy marriage and the queen was an extremely disliked individual, they did produce a daughter named Charlotte, who was then the heir to the throne. And this is the eye of Charlotte. Unfortunately, it is a memorial piece because Charlotte, in her early 20s, died in childbirth, and the baby died as well. So England lost the heir to the throne and the next heir to the throne in one fell swoop. And as we understand it, she was a very, very beloved individual, not unlike the way people felt about Princess Diana. And so the entire country went into mourning. So this is a mourning piece for her, and it has her eye is pictured, and then the bracelet is created out of her woven hair.
That's an extremely special piece. I'm surprised, forgive me for saying this, that it's not in a museum in England. So these pieces, how do you come by them? They're so rare and precious.
That's what makes them fascinating to us. They're fascinating in their own right. They're 300 years old. There may be 1,000 lover's eyes in the world. We don't count them, but maybe 350. And they are precious. And to have them in good condition, something that old that's still in good condition, has its clarity of color, and they're watercolors, has the ivory uncracked. 99.9% of them are on ivory. it's a work for us of discovering these, authenticating these, and then acquiring them for our collection. The authentication is very interesting. We have, of course, an expert that helps us with our paintings and helps us with our lover's eyes to reinforce that we're buying something that is of the age that they say. They say that a collector has about 20 years before it goes to another collector. And that means that these pieces have had maybe 15 owners. But it's fascinating for us as far as the history goes, as far as the condition. Our expert says that, and there are lover's eyes on the internet, lover's eyes for sale all over the place, but she will say, her name is Ellie Shushin, who's the editor of the book, who lives in Philadelphia, that she says that of the ones that she sees and has offered, 98 to 99% of them are fakes. And we've had a couple of fakes made by a lady artist in California of Nan's eye, and they look fine to me. They buy an old housing, which means an old ring or an old bracelet or an old brooch, and they take out whatever was in there, which could have been hair or could have been a portrait or could have been, anything, and they then put in a man-made, brand new eye. And also, the even more difficult one to recognize is where people will buy a portrait miniature, which is the whole face, made to be like a picture so you can recognize who the sitter is. But because of the exclusivity and because of the cost of the lover's eyes now, people will take the ivory and cut out the eye from the portrait miniature, put it into an old housing and sell it as an original lover's eye, which of course it is not. So it's part of the fun for us to go through the whole history of lover's eyes and then the collection of lover's eyes and the authentication of lover's eyes. And when we first started, rings were very, very, very uncommon. And we had a lot of brooches. I'd say maybe, we had maybe 12 or 14 brooches. And then all of a sudden we saw another ring after the first one. And we were so excited. We just got so happy that we found another one. Now we probably have 30 rings, 40 rings.
When you had Nan's eye painted, did you say you made it into a bracelet or did you make a ring?
Both. She has a ring and a brooch.
Correct.
I'm sure, David, you recognize her eye. As only a lover could, as I understand the story to go in any case. But these pieces of jewelry are, can you actually wear them? Because they seem very, very fragile.
I wear them infrequently.
Nan wears them. She likes to give talks, and not that she likes to do it. People love to hear her talk about our art collection and our lover's eye collection, and she's in great demand, so she will wear one during the talk. Most of them are in a safe deposit box. We keep a number of them, maybe 30 or 40 of them, at home and are safe here, which is fireproof. We think that we're temporary owners of these, and what happens to them after Nan and I are gone is of no consequence to us. We want to conserve them and preserve them for future generations.
So, for example, they're sensitive to light. So we would never leave them out where they would be in the light for an extended period of time. We want to keep them in a place where the watercolor won't fade because we are the temporary custodians. We feel a sense of responsibility to history that we keep them in the best condition that we can.
You had a couple of exhibits. I do know that. And one of them, I believe, was even, perhaps, was it written up in Architectural Digest?
Among many other publications, yes.
Yes, because I thought it was very interesting. Not only was the display room temperature controlled and the jewelry housed in glass, I guess, temperature controlled boxes, but the guests, the visitors, had iPads. They could see the jewelry in 3D. It just sounded like a very fascinating exhibit. And I know you've exhibited a couple of times since then. Are there plans to do that again?
That's a great question, Lisa. The exhibition that was originally executed by the Birmingham Museum of Art and us was a blockbuster exhibition. It was at 6 months at Birmingham. It went to the University of Georgia in Athens for 3 months. It went to Winterthur in Maryland for 3 months. Then it went to Minneapolis for 3 months. And it was a fabulous exhibition, if I must say, to congratulate the people that we worked with to make it wonderful. Right now, we are working with 2 museums who are going to take the lover's eyes, and we don't encourage it. They come to us and ask if they can display some of these. But the iPad Nan has most of the great ideas, but that was my idea because they're so small, they're so tiny, they're so precious, and they often have two sides, hair on the back or something else, engraving on the back, and then the lover's eye in the front. They often can be opened like a wallet. There's an etui that's in an ivory tube, and you unscrew it, and the etui comes out. And we thought that a video of these small objects, which it's Nan's hands doing it, would be so instructive to people. And we also thought that these small objects, and certainly people can't touch them, would be so much better appreciated on an iPad so that you could enlarge it, so that you can turn it around, so that you can do with it what you want. And also we can put information about it on the iPad. And for people whose sight is not very good anymore, it's really just life altering. And it was the first time that the iPad had been used in a museum exhibition. And we bought, I think, 10 or 12 of them and lent them to the visitors to each of the venues. And it was terrific. And we're going to do that again. With one show, we will not do it, but the other show, we will do that. It's a lot of work, Lisa, to do that.
Oh, I bet. Where are the two shows, just in case somebody in our audience lives in one of those cities?
They've not been signed yet, and I cannot tell you.
I won't force you. David, as I said earlier, you are an ophthalmologist. Do you have any clinical interest in these eyes? Like, do you look at them and say, oh, this child died of smallpox or something?
No, the eyes are not clinically significant at all. They're beautifully significant. They're physically significant, but they're not significant as far as whether they're a diseased eye or not. We have an eye that we just got the video on, our picture on from England yesterday, and it's a mystery eye, and the person who in England is sending it to us through our elocution said this eye looks like it has a disease, and it does not. The eye is a beautiful eye. The skin has a skin problem, but it's very, very, very large and historically very important. But the eye is painted from a historical perspective of someone who is living, and it is not a diseased eye. It's not an eye with a cataract or an eye with inflammation or an eye with anything like that.
So at least you did look at the eye and see that. These eyes also sometimes had flowers around them. Did they not? The eyes sort of evolve in terms of their depiction.
Yes, that's another whole interesting thing, and that is that the story is that these were all maybe 17 eyes, and many of them have more than one portrait miniature in them, were gifted to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They were never assessed to the Metropolitan, but they were given in a paper bag by this exceedingly wealthy family. And they now wanted to sell them to us, or sell most of them to us, which we have acceded to their request and bought them. And one of them is a flower eye. There are 5 known flower eyes in the world, and the flower eyes are steeped in the history of eyes and also the meaning of the eyes. And the one that we have is eye portrait from the 1700s, this is about 1805. It's Mrs. Fox, and the flower is foxglove.
Would you like me to show it?
Yeah, foxglove is what digitalis is made out of.
Oh, okay. So again, tell us what we're looking at.
Mrs. Fox with her foxglove.
I see the flowers all around the eye. Yes.
This is a tiny subcategory of another tiny subcategory. Lover's eyes are rare, and flower eyes are exceedingly rare, and they are lover's lips. We had loaned 2 pieces to a museum in Austria, in Innsbruck, Austria, called the Schloss Ambras, which is a part of the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. And so we loaned these 2 pieces happily to their exhibition, which was called Face to Face. And we, of course, then went to Austria for the opening. And so when we arrived there, these 2 pieces were in a case, in a room filled with fabulous portraits by Rembrandt and Picasso and the A-list artists. And so our 2 pieces garnered a great deal of interest. Of course, we were there and we didn't know a soul. And so I was wearing one of the rings that has a tiny, tiny, tiny circle in which there are painted lovers' lips on ivory surrounded by gold on my pinky finger. And so as an icebreaker, we were walking around the room and chatting with people, and I would put out my hand and show them this ring with the lovers' lips. And it was a way of introducing ourselves and making conversation. And so about halfway through the evening, I did this very thing, and I looked at my finger, and the housing was empty. And the tiny little sliver of ivory, which had the painted lips and the glass covering it, had fallen out. And we were in a castle which was probably 400 years old, with ancient old wooden pitted floors. So the museum staff went right to work. Everybody panicked. We did not, because we said it's a thing problem, not a people problem. But they all got out their telephones with their flashlights and looked around on the floor. And sure enough, they found this little tiny sliver of ivory unbroken at the base of a case where it met the floor. And they picked it up, and it was fine.
You were very lucky because it could have fallen between cracks or anywhere. That's a wonderful story.
We knew at the time that there were 3 known examples in the world. And so when I looked and my finger was empty, David said, well, now there are only 2 known examples in the world.
I was just going to say, well, maybe we'll get one of the other 2. You know, these were very popular for a very short period of time. And someone told me, I have not seen it, but the very popular show Bridgerton, which takes place during the Regency era, which, as I understand it, was part of the Georgian era, someone is wearing an eye. Why do you think they stopped being popular?
Well, the tradition persisted, but fads go in and out of popularity. And so it became less popular. It became a little bit more popular again in the Georgian era. And then there are some reprisals today in other forms as well. So it never completely went away, but it did have its great period of popularity, say between 1790 and 1820.
We have lots of requests all the time for use of our eyes for newspapers, for magazines. Libertine has done a whole series of, it's a manufacturer of clothing and handbags, which are all full of lovers' eyes from our collection. And we're glad to lend our images to them.
We're even on the cover of an album of a Swedish rock band.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. You did say, though, earlier that you don't know what's going to happen to the collection after you've gone on. Your children are not interested in it, or?
The children are not interested in it. And as we said, we consider ourselves the temporary custodians. We do not know what the future of this collection will be.
Well, I'm sure there's a museum out there that would love to have the entire collection. And it would be such a beautiful thing to see, truly.
It would be life-altering for a museum, but we have no plans for the future of them at this time. And to be honest, as I said before, they're at least 99% ivory. And ivory is a very difficult commodity today because of the restrictions. All of ours are Indian ivory because India was controlled by Great Britain at the time. And we were offered the idea of, because it's only African ivory that's endangered, and these are, 300 years old, and the elephants have given up their ghost a long time ago, but we could document by taking a sample, this is what the British government has said, of each piece, which means drilling a little hole in the object, and then they do DNA testing to determine that it's Indian ivory rather than African ivory. And we've said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to destroy partially each piece in order to document that it's Asian ivory when we already know it's Asian ivory.
Well, that's a whole other story. You have 2 books, of course, out about your collection, Lover's Eye and The Look of Love, which is the earlier book. They're kind of hard to find. Any suggestions to people, that is our listeners and our viewers who might want to pursue this further, where they could find the books or more about you and your collection?
Best place to find the book is on Amazon. The original book, which is out of print, they have 1 copy available, which the last time we looked was trying to sell it for $2,800 and some dollars, and that's unsigned. The books are all made in England by a company called Giles, who has been very helpful to us and very nice, and they were temporarily out of the books, and they now have found some more. Now, how many Amazon has, we don't know, but they are available on Amazon for the original price, which is $50, which we get nothing out of. It's all a donation to a museum when they buy them. We've contacted Dan Giles, who's the owner of Giles Book Manufacturing Company in London, and we are going to do a 3rd book, which will include probably 70, 80 new objects that we've acquired, but it's not signed and sealed and delivered at this time. But we think within the next year, we'll have a third book, which will be a compendium of all of the prior two and the third one. Now, we do have some books ourselves. We have a storage unit that's air conditioned and heated and temperature controlled and policed and whatever. And if someone wants a book, we would be glad to send it to them. We don't sell books. We've never sold a book except for someone else's advantage. Like museums will sell the book there, and then whatever they get for it goes to the museum. We've never sold a book for money ever, and we don't plan to. But if someone says they can't afford to get one on Amazon, and which is now $50, not the almost $3,000, we'd be glad to send them one, particularly if they made a donation to Harmony.
Well, thank you very much for that. As a matter of fact, it was out of stock when I went on Amazon, and I was fortunate enough to have been lent the book by, full disclosure, Henry Skier, your brother. And of course, A.M. Skier is the sponsor of this podcast, Harmony Talk. It's a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920, which is usually how I end this podcast. But I wanted to thank you both so much for being with us. I mean, this was fascinating. Fascinating. I'd like to see more of your collection. Maybe one day I will. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Lisa. We enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Champeau. We'll talk to you next time.